A feeling of unity and political accord in America from 1817 to 1825, associated with the presidency of James Monroe, became known as the era of good feeling. George Washington had warned Americans in his farewell address of the danger of ardent loyalty to political parties, and Monroe set about, after winning the presidency, to follow Washington's advice and unify the political will of the nation. Did he actually achieve an era of good feeling? Do we still enjoy these good feelings in our nation? I'm Tom Army, and this is United States History Online. Psychologists have noted that when a person provides 3 or more reasons for a decision, often none of the reasons have validity. Historians have suggested multiple reasons for the War of 1812, and yet they find few benefits resulting from the conclusion of the war. Most New England Federalists had opposed the war from the start. They feared financial ruin from loss of commercial shipping and halted trade with Great Britain. Although the United States logged several impressive naval victories in the war, the Democratic-Republican administration of President Madison seemed to mismanage the Army's efforts in the conflict. So a group of angry Federalists held a series of meetings in Hartford, Connecticut in December 1814 to discuss their grievances over this disastrous and relentless war. The Federalists in Congress had blocked the administration's efforts to finance the war. Massachusetts and Connecticut had refused to subject their militia to the orders of the War Department. And President Madison worried that New England might seek to negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain. Then great news arrived. Andrew Jackson's small force of Army regulars, Tennessee militia, Choctaws, and pirates defeated a much larger British force at the Battle of New Orleans. Shortly after the battle, news of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium finally reached Washington, D.C. This treaty meant the agonizing War of 1812 was finally over. Although the treaty was signed on December 24, 1814, before the Battle of New Orleans took place, it appeared to Americans that Jackson's victory had forced the British to seek peace. The apparent military victory ending the war made the Federalists whining at their Hartford Convention appear traitorous, unpatriotic, and cowardly. This perception ruined the Federalist Party, and the Federalists soon evaporated as a force in national politics. James Monroe's landslide victory in 1816 over Federalist Rufus King, the last Federalist candidate for president, marked a period in American history that reflected the spirit and pride of a new nationalism and unity after the War of 1812. Monroe's goal of national unity and the elimination of disruptive party politics played out in his goodwill tour of the United States after his inauguration in 1817. The success of that tour caused the Boston Federalist newspaper, the Columbian Sentinel, to coin the phrase, era of good feeling. Art and literature promoted this spirit of national pride and celebration. Festive commemorations celebrated the heroes of the Revolution and the War of 1812. Congress purchased John Trumbull's paintings of Revolutionary War heroes and hung them in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. The elections of 1818 returned an overwhelming number of Democratic Republicans to Congress, strengthening the idea that the dangerous factions of the first-party system had given way to a spirit of political cooperation within the national government. This spirit of cooperation manifested itself in the implementation of an economic plan called the American System. Interestingly enough, the plan was rooted in the economic philosophy of Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, and it sought to make the United States economically independent and nationally self-sufficient. The plan rested on three core principles. One, protective tariffs to grow American industry. Two, internal improvements to expand transportation networks. And three, a national bank to promote business and control wildcat speculation. Jeffersonians before the War of 1812 considered Hamilton's ideas contrary to the goals of an agrarian, self-sufficient, and free society. Following the war, Henry Clay actively promoted this Hamiltonian vision, and many Democratic Republicans now embraced this new American system. This metamorphosis helped contribute to the feeling of growing American nationalism, and it fueled this era of good feeling. In 1819, the era of good feeling, however, began to splinter. Western expansion, the Panic of 1819, and Missouri's statehood, among other things, fostered skepticism, animosity, and division. The Jeffersonian social philosophy of self-sufficiency led Republicans to encourage Western expansion after the War of 1812. National infrastructure improvements, like the Cumberland Road, the completion of the Erie Canal, and the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the 1820 Land Act, they all fostered the movement of goods and services and people westward. Now, to facilitate economic expansion, the Secretary of the Treasury, William Crawford, wanted to republicanize credit. He began to allow the U.S. Treasury, whose money was kept in the Second Bank of the United States, to accept land payments in the form of banknotes issued by Western and Southern state banks. These state banks often lacked sufficient gold and silver reserves to back up their vastly overextended credit. Consequently, in the summer of 1818, the U.S. Bank called for a sharp credit contraction. In other words, the Second U.S. Bank demanded that the state banks redeem their banknotes for gold or silver. Most state banks could not do this, so they were forced to call in their loans on the heavily mortgaged lands they had financed. As a consequence, cash-poor farmers saw their land values drop as much as 75%. State banks started to foreclose on these properties and transfer the land to their creditor, the Second Bank of the United States. Adding to this financial crisis, the value of cotton dropped 25% and threw the U.S. into a depression named the Panic of 1819. Some Democratic Republicans blame the state banks and a lack of regulation for the panic. Others blame this economic disaster on the second U.S. Bank, Eastern capitalists, selfish land speculators, and corrupt politicians. During this period, the Supreme Court handed down several rulings that strengthened the power of corporations and the U.S. Bank and increase the power of the national government. Men such as William Crawford and Andrew Jackson railed against these decisions. They believed the federal government was unjustly denying opportunities to the states, their banks, and to the common people who sought only to preserve their rightful property and economic freedom. Crawford believed that the future of the country rested on the equitable distribution of wealth, states' rights, expanding credit, and no regulation. Men like Monroe and Marshall believed the country's future rested on sound banking principles, private property rights, commerce and entrepreneurship, and skillful economic regulation. So, although Monroe ran unopposed for president in 1820, and although he received all but one electoral vote, new bitter political divisions were starting to form. Missouri's statehood added heat to the fire. In 1819, Congress discussed the admission of Missouri as a slave state. The debate regarding statehood seemed routine until Jeffersonian Republican James Talmadge Jr. of New York, who opposed slavery in general, offered an amendment to the bill that would prevent slaves from entering Missouri after statehood was approved. Plus, all children born as slaves in Missouri would be freed at 25 years old. A firestorm erupted. Northern congressmen objected to slavery's expansion because of the constitutional inequalities of the 3/5 rule, the so-called federal ratio. Look that one up. Furthermore, the Senate had been balanced with 11 free states and 11 slave states. Missouri, as a slave state, would tip the balance and give the slave states a 2-vote majority in the Senate. Many Northerners already felt the South had too much influence in the federal government, as evidenced by the fact that 4 of the first 5 presidents hailed from the state of Virginia. Some Southerners questioned the legitimacy of slavery, yet they appeared united as a section when confronted with an external challenge to the institution. They believed Northerners had no right to infringe upon the South's constitutional right to own slaves, and a Northern attack on slavery might even incite servile insurrection in the South, something Southerners truly feared. It took the political skills of Speaker of the House Henry Clay to work out a compromise. He convinced both sides to accept Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and Senator Jesse B. Thomas's proviso that excluded slavery from the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel. By the election of 1824, the era of good feelings appears to have faded. 5 men ran for president that year, and on the horizon emerged the formation of 2 new parties: the Democracy, as the Democrats called it, and the Whigs. The U.S. Bank, corporations, credit, currency, internal improvements, slavery, the distribution of wealth, and commercial interests became the issues that helped define the emerging second party system in American history. So, was the United States ever united during the era of good feelings? The period started out on a positive note when the expression first appeared in the Columbian Sentinel. Yet, do you think the expression historians use to describe this period is ultimately misleading? Is that the point? Has America lost its good feelings forever?